Mr. Speaker, this country has many faces of bravery. And today I want to recognize the courageous patriotism of active duty Army officer Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who recently returned from a second tour in Afghanistan. He traveled thousands of miles throughout the country patrolling with American troops in 8 provinces and spoke to hundreds of Afghan and American security officers and civilians about conditions on the ground. Convinced that senior leaders of this war, both uniformed and civilian, have intentionally and consistently misled the American people about the conditions in Afghanistan, Davis wrote an 84-page report challenging the military's assertion that the war in Afghanistan has been a success. This report, which I read, was written at great risk to Lieutenant Colonel Davis's military career and personal life, and it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the war in Afghanistan and the decision-making that has led us to our current situation. Davis reports, quote, "Senior-ranking U.S. military leaders have so distorted the truth when communicating with the U.S. Congress and American people in regards to conditions on the ground in Afghanistan that the truth has become unrecognizable." I strongly encourage every member of Congress to read this report as soon as possible. It's like the Pentagon Papers in its power. After reading it, you will find it impossible not to heed Davis' advice to hold public congressional hearings on the state of the Afghan war. More than 5,500 Americans were killed or wounded in Afghanistan in 2011 alone. How many more, he says, must die in support of a mission that is not succeeding? That's his question. Each and every one of us ought to ask himself or herself this difficult question. Even our intelligence agencies are skeptical about the Afghan war and if it's salvageable and our objectives realistic. Last month, a national intelligence estimate given to President Obama painted a bleak picture about our efforts in Afghanistan. At current levels of foreign assistance by the U.S. and Europe, which will be hard to sustain under the budgetary pressures, the NIE does not forecast rapid improvements in Afghan security forces or governance or the removal of the Taliban. I fear that we have forgotten the difference between respect for our military leaders and unquestioning deference to them. Questioning the war's strategy and objectives and consequences all too often discredits one's patriotism and impugns one's motive. Yet that unflinching assessment is precisely what the Lieutenant Colonel implores us to do. After 10 years in Afghanistan, what is the wisest course for us now? Sadly, we cannot even begin to answer that question because rampant overclassification of information has made it nearly impossible for the Congress to fully oversee, evaluate, and perhaps recast our war efforts. Recently declassified information about the Afghan war exposed brutal realities that have been withheld from the public. American troops incidentally and accidentally killing Afghan civilians, widespread corruption in the U.S.-backed Karzai government, and revelations about Pakistan's assistance to Afghan insurgents, to name just a few. Not every American has traveled 9,000 miles and witnessed what Lieutenant Colonel Davis has seen, heard, and understand. But we can, in this body, and must begin to investigate the charges of deception and dishonesty in his report. For our democracy to work, congressional officials and the public must have access to this type of information. The American public, which bears the extraordinary cost of this war, both in money and in pain, deserves to know the truth. The ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus cautioned, quote, "In war, truth is the first casualty." It is time to reclaim the truth of our war in Afghanistan by having congressional hearings. They should begin now. Some of us believe we ought to bring the troops home more quickly than the president, but we have to have hearings so that the American public will understand why it is this action should be taken. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair